Every astronaut who lands on Mars may never set foot on Earth again. 140 million miles away, 9 months of travel, and a body that begins breaking down the moment it leaves. We will visit the psychological trap that makes leaving Mars nearly impossible, the radiation that rewires the brain, and the moment a crew realizes the return window has closed forever. If you enjoy the journey, like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Strap in. We begin. Picture standing on a beach looking out at the ocean. You can see maybe 3 miles to the horizon. That is the edge of your world from where you stand. Now multiply that distance by 47 million. That is how far away Mars is at its closest point to Earth. And that is the good day. On a bad day, when both planets sit on opposite sides of their orbits, Mars sits 350 million miles away. For this mission, the crew launches during an average window, 140 million miles. The number sounds clean. The reality is anything but. The spacecraft leaves Earth orbit and immediately enters a silence unlike anything the crew has trained for. There are no weather updates from the window. No cities below. The stars do not twinkle out here because there is no atmosphere to distort them. They just sit there, hard and cold and motionless, like holes punched through a black sheet. Earth shrinks behind the ship. Within a few weeks it looks like a bright marble. Within a few months, it is just another dot among thousands. The journey takes between 6 and 9 months depending on the trajectory. Mission planners choose a path called a Hohmann transfer, which is essentially a curved arc that lets the ship coast most of the way using minimal fuel. The engines do not blast continuously. The crew is not rocketing through space. They are falling in a long, slow curve. A football thrown across a field follows the same basic physics, except this football takes the better part of a year to land. Inside, the habitat module is roughly the size of a studio apartment. 6 people share it. There is a kitchen area, sleeping bunks stacked close together, a small exercise zone, and a medical bay the size of a large closet. Every inch is used. Nothing is wasted. The crew trains for years to live inside this space without losing their minds. But training on Earth is not the same as floating inside a metal tube with nowhere to go and the void pressing in from every wall. The ship has no gravity. Everything floats. Food, tools, moisture from breathing, all of it drifts unless strapped down or contained. Sleeping in microgravity feels like floating in a pool that never ends. It sounds peaceful. After weeks, it stops feeling that way. The body adapts in ways that begin causing real damage almost immediately, but that part comes later. Communication with Earth works at the speed of light, which sounds fast until you realize the signal still takes between 3 and 22 minutes to arrive, depending on orbital positions. During the early weeks of transit, a message home gets a response in about 6 minutes. By the time the crew approaches Mars, the delay stretches past 20 minutes each way. A conversation becomes a series of voice memos. Mission control cannot help in real time. If something breaks, the crew fixes it, or the crew dies. That is the deal. Halfway through the journey, something shifts in the crew's psychology. Earth is too far away to feel real. Mars is still too far away to feel close. The crew exists in a kind of in-between zone with nothing anchoring them to either world. Some mission simulations show that this midpoint is when morale starts cracking. Small arguments stretch into long silences. Routines become obsessions. The walls feel closer than they did a month ago, and they have not even arrived yet. What happens when they finally break through the Martian atmosphere and touch down on that rust-colored surface is only the beginning of a much stranger problem. In September of 1620, 102 people climbed aboard a wooden ship called the Mayflower and sailed west from England. They had no GPS, no rescue plan, no promise of return. They knew the crossing would take months and that the land on the other side was mostly unknown. Some of them would not survive the first winter. They went anyway. They went because the goal was never to visit. The goal was to stay. Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon in 1969. He stood on another world and came home. For decades after, people assumed that was the model. You go, you explore, you come back. Aldrin himself eventually argued against that model for Mars. In a public statement that surprised a lot of people, he said the first humans to land on Mars should stay there permanently. The mission should not be a visit. It should be a settlement. He called it the Martian version of the Mayflower crossing. You do not build a civilization with a round-trip ticket. The logic is cleaner than it sounds at first. A return mission requires 2 complete spacecraft, one to get there, one to get back. It requires enough fuel for both legs of the journey. It requires launch infrastructure on the Martian surface to get the return vehicle off the ground. Every single one of those requirements is brutally difficult. Removing the return leg does not just cut costs, it removes the hardest part of the entire mission. Think about it in terms of weight. Getting 1 pound of anything off Earth costs enormous amounts of fuel. Getting 1 pound off Mars costs less because Martian gravity is weaker, but the challenge is that there is no fueling station on Mars. Every pound of return fuel either has to be launched from Earth and dragged all the way there, or manufactured on the surface using technology that has never been fully tested in real Martian conditions. A one-way mission eliminates both problems instantly. Former mission designers have pointed out that the Pilgrims did not sail to America carrying a ship's worth of supplies for the return voyage. They used every resource they had to survive and build. The first Mars crew would do the same. Instead of packing a return rocket, they pack more food, more water recycling equipment, more scientific gear. The mission becomes richer the moment returning stops being part of the plan. Over 165,000 people formally applied to the Mars One organization in 2013 when it announced a one-way colonization mission. These were not thrill-seekers lying about their motivations. Researchers who studied the applicant pool found engineers, doctors, teachers and scientists among the top candidates, people with families, people with careers, people who looked at the idea of a permanent one-way trip and said yes without hesitation. That number should stop you for a second. 165,000 people voluntarily raised their hands to never come home. Something about the Mayflower framing resonates at a deep level. Humans have always moved toward the unknown and built something permanent on the other side. The pattern repeats across every continent on Earth. Mars would simply be the first time that pattern crossed a planetary boundary. The hard question is whether the destination can actually support people long enough for a settlement to take root. And the answer to that question involves forces far more dangerous than distance. In 2013, an organization called Mars One put out a global announcement. It was looking for volunteers to travel to Mars on a one-way mission with no return. The application was open to anyone over 18. No astronaut experience required. The cost to apply was just under $40. 165,000 people from over 100 countries submitted applications within a few months. The media treated it mostly as a curiosity, a stunt. People assumed the applicants were dreamers with nothing to lose, young idealists who had not fully thought it through. Researchers who actually studied the pool found something different. The top candidates were overwhelmingly educated professionals between the ages of 25 and 45. Many had advanced degrees. Several were medical doctors. One was a geologist with fieldwork experience in some of the most remote places on Earth. These were people who understood what they were signing up for, and they signed up anyway. Psychologists tried to figure out what those 165,000 people had in common. A few patterns emerged. A strong sense of purpose beyond personal survival, a belief that the mission mattered more than individual comfort, and something researchers described as a high tolerance for irreversibility. Most people, when they make a big decision, keep a mental back door open. These volunteers closed the door in their minds before they even submitted the application. One applicant described it this way in an interview. She had spent her whole life feeling like she was born in the wrong era. She wanted to be part of something that no human had ever attempted. Going home after doing that felt like the less interesting part of the story. That framing shows up again and again among serious one-way mission advocates. The return trip is almost beside the point. The act of being the first permanent human presence on another planet is the point. Everything after that is details. Not everyone who applied was motivated by exploration. Some applicants were clearly running toward Mars because something on Earth felt unbearable. Researchers noted this subset quickly and filtered them out. The mission profile they were targeting required people who could build community under pressure, not people escaping. 1. A crew of 6 cannot afford someone whose motivation collapses once the novelty wears off and the isolation sets in. The selection process Mars One designed ran through multiple rounds of psychological evaluation, physical testing, and group simulations. The scenarios tested how candidates handled conflict in confined spaces, how they made decisions without outside input, and whether they could maintain emotional stability after weeks of simulated communication blackouts. What the simulations revealed was telling. The candidates who scored highest were not the most technically skilled. They were the ones who stayed calm when plans fell apart, who made decisions quickly without needing reassurance, and who found ways to keep the group functional even when they personally felt the weight of the situation. Those qualities matter because on Mars, every single day will test them, and the testing starts before the ship even leaves Earth orbit, because the moment the engines fire and the planet shrinks behind the crew, the psychological pressure begins building, slowly at first, then faster than anyone expects. What actually happens inside a human mind after months of total isolation is one of the most unsettling parts of this entire mission, and it gets worse the closer the crew gets to the surface. Landing on Mars is hard, brutally hard. The atmosphere is thin enough that a parachute alone cannot slow a spacecraft down enough to land safely, but thick enough to create a wall of friction and heat during entry. Engineers call this the 7 minutes of terror. The spacecraft hits the atmosphere at around 12,000 miles per hour and has to decelerate to nearly zero in less than 7 minutes using a combination of heat shields, parachutes, and rockets. If anything goes wrong during those 7 minutes, the mission ends. But getting to the surface is not actually the hardest part of the mission. Getting off the surface is. To launch a rocket from Earth, you need massive amounts of fuel. Earth's gravity is strong, and the atmosphere is thick. A fully fueled rocket headed to orbit weighs mostly fuel. The vehicle and the payload riding inside it are a small fraction of the total mass at launch. For Mars, the gravity is weaker and the atmosphere is much thinner, so you need less fuel to reach orbit. That sounds like good news. It is not, because the fuel still has to come from somewhere. If the mission carries return fuel from Earth, that fuel adds enormous weight to the outbound journey. Getting heavy things to Mars costs a staggering amount of energy. Every extra pound launched from Earth multiplies the cost of the mission significantly. Carrying enough return fuel from home would make the spacecraft so heavy that the mission becomes nearly impossible to execute with current technology. The alternative is manufacturing fuel on Mars. Scientists call this in situ resource utilization, which is a fancy way of saying use what is already there. Mars has carbon dioxide in its atmosphere and water ice locked in its soil. Through a chemical process, you can theoretically combine those materials to produce methane and liquid oxygen, which are exactly the propellants a rocket engine needs. The idea works in a laboratory. Engineers have built small-scale versions of the required equipment and produced real rocket propellant using simulated Martian materials. In 2021, a device the size of a car battery landed on Mars aboard a robotic mission and successfully produced a small amount of oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. It worked. It was a genuine milestone. But here is the gap between that milestone and a crewed return mission. Producing enough fuel to launch 6 people off the surface of Mars requires an industrial-scale chemical plant operating continuously for years before the crew even arrives. That plant has to survive Martian dust storms that can blanket the entire planet for months. It has to operate in temperatures that drop to -160 degrees Fahrenheit at night. It has to run without a single critical failure for an extended period, because if it breaks down and cannot be repaired remotely, the crew lands with no way home. No such plant has been built, no such plant has been tested in real Martian conditions. The engineering challenges are real and significant, and the timeline for solving them is unclear. So what happens if the crew arrives and the fuel plant has failed? That is the question mission planners quietly carry with them. And the deeper you go into the logistics of a return mission, the more that question starts to feel less like a worst-case scenario and more like a likely one. The idea of manufacturing rocket fuel on Mars has a name that sounds straightforward: in situ resource utilization. Strip away the technical label, and what you have is one of the most ambitious engineering challenges humans have ever designed. Mars is not a dead planet. Its atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide. Its polar caps and subsurface hold enormous reserves of frozen water. Both of those raw materials are the ingredients for methane-based rocket fuel. The chemical pathway is called the Sabatier reaction. You combine carbon dioxide with hydrogen, apply heat and a catalyst, and you get methane and water as outputs. The water can then be split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. The oxygen becomes part of the fuel mix. The hydrogen loops back into the process. On paper, it is elegant. The planet itself supplies the ingredients. A well-designed plant could theoretically run on Martian solar power or a small nuclear reactor, process the local atmosphere and soil, and slowly build up a fuel reserve over a period of years. By the time the crew lands, the return tank is already full. The device that demonstrated this on a real scale, even a tiny one, was called MOXIE. It stood for Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment. It arrived on Mars in 2021 aboard the Perseverance rover, sitting inside the rover's body like a small glowing box. Over the following 2 years, it produced oxygen from the Martian atmosphere multiple times. The highest single output it achieved was enough oxygen to support a person for about 10 minutes. That sounds underwhelming, and in terms of mission requirements, it is. A crewed return mission requires not 10 minutes of oxygen, but thousands of times that volume, plus the methane to burn it. Scaling the MOXIE result up to mission-ready fuel production means building a plant roughly the size of a small factory. That factory needs to operate in a place where temperatures swing more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit between day and night, where dust storms can last for months and coat every solar panel to the point of uselessness, where there are no technicians, no spare parts warehouse, and no ability to get a service crew there faster than 9 months. The plant would need to arrive on Mars years before the crew. Robotic systems would need to assemble it, start it, test it, and run it continuously without a single catastrophic failure. If the fuel reserve falls short, or if a key component fails and cannot be fixed remotely, the crew lands into a trap. Engineers are working on solutions: backup fuel strategies, redundant systems, nuclear power sources that do not depend on sunlight. The progress is real, but the gap between laboratory demonstration and a working full-scale plant on another planet is measured in decades of engineering work, not years. What makes this problem feel different from other technical challenges in space exploration is the consequence of failure. If the fuel plant underperforms, there is no second chance. The return window only opens every 2 years when Earth and Mars align. Miss it, and the crew waits another 2 years, run out of supplies waiting, and the mission ends in the worst way possible. Every engineer who works on Mars return logistics knows this. They keep working because the alternative is accepting that the mission was always one way from the start, and some of them are beginning to quietly wonder if accepting that might actually be the smarter plan. Imagine arriving somewhere and being told you cannot leave for 2 years, minimum. No exceptions, no early checkout. The doors open when they open, and you wait. That is the situation every Mars crew faces the moment they touch down. Earth and Mars orbit the Sun at different speeds. Earth takes 365 days to complete one orbit. Mars takes 687 Earth days. Because of that difference, the two planets only align in a way that makes the return journey fuel efficient once every roughly 2 years. That alignment is called a launch window, and missing it means waiting for the next one. You cannot just point the ship at Earth and go. The planets have to be in the right positions for the trip to be possible without burning through fuel reserves that do not exist. Mission planners call this the synodic period. It is not a problem specific to Mars. Every planet in the solar system has its own version of this cycle. But for Mars, the numbers create a particularly tight constraint. After landing, the crew typically has a surface stay of roughly 500 days, sometimes longer before the next Earth return window opens. 500 days is about 16.5 months. Call it a year and a half minimum. During those 500 days, the crew is on their own. Earth is listening, but Earth cannot help in any meaningful physical sense. If supplies run low, no resupply ship arrives in time. If someone is severely injured, there is no medevac. The crew manages everything with what they have. Their survival depends entirely on the systems they brought with them, the fuel that was pre-positioned if the return mission is still part of the plan, and their own collective ability to keep functioning under extreme stress. For context on what 500 days of isolation actually feels like, consider the longest continuous stays aboard the International Space Station. Some astronauts have spent over a year in orbit. They return home describing a complicated kind of re-entry, not just physically, but emotionally. Earth felt unfamiliar. Social situations felt overwhelming after so long in a structured, confined environment, and those astronauts could see Earth out the window the entire time. The Mars crew cannot. The 2-year surface stay is not just a logistical problem, it is a psychological one. The crew lands, sets up operations, begins exploring and conducting experiments, and then waits. The first few months have novelty driving them. Everything is new. Every rock sample is a potential discovery, but novelty fades. And what replaces it is routine, monotony, and the slow grinding awareness that home is not an option right now. Researchers who study long-duration isolation missions say the hardest period is not the first months and not the final stretch before return. The hardest period is the middle, the long flat part of the timeline where neither end feels close. On Mars, that middle stretch lasts longer than almost any isolation mission ever attempted on Earth, and while the crew is living through that middle stretch, their bodies are doing something that makes the return option even less certain than the math already suggests. Something quiet and steady happening in their bones and their muscles and their brains, whether they notice it or not. The human skeleton is not a static structure, it is alive. Bones are constantly being broken down and rebuilt by 2 types of cells working in opposition. One type tears down old bone tissue, the other rebuilds it. On Earth, gravity keeps this process roughly balanced. Your bones carry your weight all day, every day, and that mechanical load signals your body to keep rebuilding at a rate that matches what is being lost. Remove gravity, and that signal disappears. In microgravity, the breakdown cells keep working, but the rebuild signal weakens dramatically. The result is that bones lose density at a rate that has no equivalent in everyday life on Earth. Astronauts in orbit lose roughly 1 to 2% of their bone density every single month. A person with serious osteoporosis on Earth might lose 1 to 2% per year. In space, that same loss happens 12 times faster. The Mars crew spends between 6 and 9 months in microgravity during transit. By the time they arrive at Mars, A crew member who started with healthy bones has already lost somewhere between 6 and 18% of their skeletal density. The bones look the same from the outside. They are not the same on the inside. They are lighter, more porous, and more fragile. A fall that would leave a bruise on Earth could now break something. Exercise equipment on the spacecraft is designed to fight this. Crew members follow rigorous daily workout routines using resistance machines and treadmills, with harnesses that push their body against a platform to simulate load. The protocols help. They do not fully solve the problem. The best-conditioned astronaut in the history of space travel still returns from a long-duration mission with measurable bone loss that takes months to recover. Now consider the landing on Mars. The crew descends through the atmosphere, touches down, and for the first time in 6 to 9 months, gravity pulls on their bodies again. Martian gravity is 38% of Earth's. That is less than half of what they left behind, but it is real, and it is constant. Their depleted skeletal system now has to support their body weight around the clock. Early Mars surface operations would be physically demanding, setting up additional habitat modules, moving equipment, conducting geological surveys across rocky terrain. All of it requires a body that can take punishment. A crew with significantly weakened bones, doing heavy physical work in spacesuits that weigh hundreds of pounds on Earth, is operating under serious risk. Countermeasures are being developed. Pharmaceutical treatments that target the specific cells responsible for bone breakdown have shown promise in clinical studies. Nutritional protocols with carefully calibrated calcium and vitamin D levels help. Some researchers are exploring whether periodic high-intensity vibration platforms could trick the skeletal system into maintaining density without traditional load-bearing exercise. Progress is real. The problem is not fully solved, and bone loss is only one piece of the biological story. The muscles suffer alongside the skeleton. The cardiovascular system weakens without the constant fight against Earth's gravity. Even the distribution of fluid in the body shifts in microgravity, pushing fluid toward the head and creating pressure on the eyes that can permanently alter vision. 6 to 9 months of transit, then 2 years on a surface with fractional gravity. Then, if a return is even attempted, another 6 to 9 months of microgravity on the way home. The body that lands back on Earth, if it lands at all, is not the same body that left. Mars pulls at you with about 38% of the force Earth does. Stand on the Martian surface, and you would weigh a little more than a third of what you weigh right now. A person who weighs 150 pounds on Earth weighs about 57 pounds on Mars. That sounds appealing in a light-hearted way, until you understand what living in that reduced gravity does to a human body over years. The human body is not designed for 38% gravity. It is designed for 100%. Every system inside you, every muscle, every organ, every circulatory pathway, evolved over millions of years under a specific gravitational load. Change that load and the systems adapt. That adaptation is the problem. Within months of living in Martian gravity, the body begins recalibrating. Muscles that no longer need to support full Earth weight begin to shrink. The heart, which is a muscle, begins to weaken too because it does not need to pump blood as hard against a lower gravitational field. Researchers studying long-duration spaceflight have documented these changes in astronauts returning from the International Space Station. And that environment has zero gravity, which is worse. Mars is better than zero gravity, but significantly worse than Earth. After a year on Mars, the body has partially adapted to the new gravitational environment. After 2 years, the adaptation is deeper. The crew members are not as strong as they were when they landed, but they function well in the environment they are living in. They have found a new normal. Here is where the return mission becomes genuinely dangerous. Put these adapted bodies back into a spacecraft for another 6 to 9 months of zero gravity, and all the progress made in Martian gravity erodes. Then land on Earth, where gravity suddenly snaps back to full strength. The body that steps off the return ship has spent years adapting away from Earth normal. The bones are fragile, the muscles are weakened, the heart is not pumping at full capacity, and suddenly that body has to support its full Earth weight for the first time in years. Returning astronauts from the International Space Station, after stays of only 6 to 12 months, sometimes cannot walk off the spacecraft unassisted. They need months of intensive rehabilitation just to function normally on Earth. Some report that their bodies never fully return to pre-mission condition. A Mars crew would face a version of that same crisis after a far longer absence from full gravity. The rehabilitation required would be extensive. Whether full recovery is even possible after years of low-gravity adaptation is an open question that science cannot yet answer. Some researchers have proposed that the crew could spend the return transit in a centrifuge module that simulates Earth gravity to help reacclimate the body before landing. The technology exists in theory. It has never been tested in a real long-duration mission. It is one more engineering problem stacked on top of all the others. What this gravity problem actually means, stripped of technical language, is that the human body becomes a prisoner of the planet it adapts to. Go to Mars long enough, and Mars owns you. Coming back is not just logistically hard, it may be biologically impossible for some crew members. Their bodies will have quietly made the decision for them, even before anyone officially decides the mission is one way. The body does not ask permission, it does not wait for a decision from mission control, or a vote among the crew. It simply adjusts, quietly, continuously, and without any regard for what the original plan was. This is how biology has always worked. Humans who move to high altitudes develop higher red blood cell counts over generations because thinner air means less oxygen with each breath, and the body compensates. Populations living near the Arctic adapted to cold in ways that are measurable in their physiology right now. The body is a survival machine that reads its environment and rewires itself accordingly. Mars would be no different. The adaptations that begin during the transit continue on the surface. The muscles are recalibrating, but the deeper changes involve systems that are harder to measure and harder to reverse. The vestibular system, which controls balance and spatial orientation, adapts to the new gravitational environment. The cardiovascular system restructures itself. Even at the cellular level, prolonged exposure to reduced gravity and radiation alters gene expression in ways researchers are still working to understand. Studies from long-duration missions aboard the International Space Station have shown that some biological changes in astronauts are persistent even after return to Earth. The famous twin study run by a space agency tracked two brothers, one who spent nearly a year in orbit and one who stayed on Earth. The astronaut returned with changes in gene expression that persisted for months after landing. Some markers were still shifted years later. That was 1 year in orbit. Mars missions would expose the body to a different gravitational environment for multiple years, plus the transit periods in zero gravity on either side. A crew member who spends 3 years on Mars and in transit arrives back at Earth carrying a body that has been systematically rebuilt for a world with less than half the gravitational pull. The nervous system has adjusted its expectations. The musculoskeletal system has reallocated resources. The heart has changed its operating baseline. Reacclimation to Earth gravity at that point is not a recovery process. It is closer to asking the body to relearn a set of physical rules it has spent years forgetting. Physical therapy programs for returning astronauts are already intensive even for short-duration missions. Scaling those programs to a multi-year Mars mission returns is an entirely different problem, and one that has not been tested because no one has done it. There is another layer to this. The psychological impact of physical vulnerability compounds the problem. Imagine returning from Mars, the greatest journey in human history, only to find that you cannot stand up without assistance, that your body, which you trained to peak condition before launch, has been quietly reshaped by years on another world, that the planet you came from now feels heavier, harder, and more demanding than the one you adapted to. Some crew members might recover fully, others might not. Either way, the body has already registered its preference. It built itself for Mars, and the longer someone stays, the more complete that registration becomes. The biological case for a permanent settlement is, in some ways, written inside the bodies of the crew themselves. Their bones and muscles and nervous systems are already beginning to vote. Between the planets, space is not empty. It looks empty, in the sense that there is no air, no sound, no weather, but it is saturated with something invisible and relentless: radiation. On Earth, you are protected from most of that radiation by two things. First, the planet's magnetic field, which deflects charged particles from the Sun and from deep space, redirecting them around the planet like water around the hull of a ship. Second, the atmosphere, which absorbs much of the radiation that gets through. Most of the cosmic rays that could damage your cells never reach you. The planet absorbs them so you do not have to. Leave Earth, and both protections vanish simultaneously. In deep space, a crew is exposed to two main sources of radiation. The first is solar particle events, which are bursts of high-energy particles thrown out by the Sun during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These events can deliver dangerous radiation doses in a matter of hours. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station get some warning and can shelter in the most shielded sections. On a deep space transit, the options are more limited. The second source is galactic cosmic rays. These are not local. They originate from supernovas and other violent events happening across the galaxy and beyond. They arrive continuously from every direction. There is no way to predict them. There is no sheltered section of a spacecraft that stops them entirely. Thick shielding helps, but adding mass to a spacecraft has its own costs, and even the densest practical shielding cannot stop the most energetic particles. During the 6 to 9 month transit to Mars, a crew member accumulates radiation exposure that exceeds the lifetime limit set by most space agencies for low Earth orbit astronauts. They reach that limit before they even land. Then they spend 2 years on a surface with almost no magnetic field, and an atmosphere so thin it provides minimal shielding. The radiation keeps coming. Long-term radiation exposure at these levels significantly increases cancer risk. That is the most commonly cited consequence, and it is serious. But researchers studying the neurological effects have found something arguably more disturbing in the short term. Galactic cosmic rays are energetic enough to pass through a spacecraft hull and through a human skull and interact directly with brain tissue. Laboratory studies using animals exposed to simulated cosmic radiation showed behavioral changes, memory problems, and impaired decision-making that appeared within weeks of exposure. The radiation was physically altering the structure and function of the brain. For a crew that needs to make clear, high-stakes decisions every day for years, that finding matters enormously. And it gets worse the moment they consider turning around and making the return trip. All of that radiation exposure accumulates. The return journey adds another 6 to 9 months to the total. The crew that lands back on Earth, if they do, carries years of deep space radiation damage in their bodies. The invisible flood never stops. It just waits for something worth damaging to pass through it. Picture the human brain as a city. The hippocampus is the city's navigation center, responsible for building memories and helping you find your way through space and information. The prefrontal cortex is City Hall, handling planning, impulse control, and complex decision-making. Both are essential. Both are specific targets of the radiation environment in deep space. Scientists studying the neurological effects of galactic cosmic rays have found that these particles cause inflammation in brain tissue and disrupt the way neurons communicate with each other. The damage is not dramatic at first. There is no obvious moment where a crew member suddenly behaves differently. The changes accumulate slowly, which in some ways makes them harder to catch. Studies using mice exposed to doses of radiation similar to what a Mars crew would receive showed measurable impairments in tasks involving memory and flexible thinking within 6 weeks. The animals became more anxious. They struggled with problems that required adapting to new rules. Their ability to navigate mazes they had previously learned degraded noticeably. Translating animal studies to humans requires caution, and researchers are careful about overstating the findings. But the biological mechanisms being studied in animals exist in human brains too. The hippocampus in a mouse and the hippocampus in a person are not identical, but they are built on the same fundamental architecture. What damages one tends to damage the other. For the Mars crew, the implications are real and practical. The crew members most exposed to radiation during transit are also the ones who need to make the most critical decisions during landing and early surface operations. Setting up habitat systems, managing life support equipment, conducting geological fieldwork, making calls about when to shelter during solar events. All of these require sharp thinking, good memory, and the ability to adapt plans quickly when things go wrong. Cognitive decline, even mild cognitive decline, in that environment is dangerous in a way it would not be in an office building or a hospital. A small lapse in judgment on Earth means a mistake. A small lapse in judgment on Mars, where every system is keeping 6 people alive in a hostile environment, can cascade quickly into a catastrophic failure. Mission planners have recognized this. Current research is focused on pharmaceutical countermeasures that might reduce neurological inflammation during transit, targeted antioxidant protocols, and modified mission schedules that minimize radiation exposure during the most cognitively demanding phases of the mission. Progress is happening. The problem has not been solved. And here is the detail that tends to land heavily when people hear it for the first time. The radiation damage to the brain does not stop accumulating when the crew lands on Mars. It continues throughout the surface stay. Then it continues again on the return trip, if there is one. The total exposure over a full round-trip mission represents a level of neurological stress that no human in history has ever sustained. Some researchers have quietly started asking whether the people who arrive back on Earth from a Mars round trip would be the same people who left. Not emotionally, biologically, at the cellular level, in the tissue of the organ that makes them who they are. That question does not have a clean answer yet, but it is being asked. And the fact that it is being asked tells you something important about how seriously scientists are taking what happens inside the brain between here and Mars. Imagine something goes wrong on Mars. A habitat seal begins leaking. One of the life support systems throws an error code. A crew member takes a bad fall in a spacesuit and is not moving. The crew leader grabs the communication system and sends an urgent message to mission control. Then waits. The speed of light is the fastest anything can travel in the universe. A radio signal from Mars moving at that maximum speed takes between 3 and 22 minutes to reach Earth, depending on where both planets are in their orbits. During the closest approach, about 3 minutes. During the farthest alignment, about 22 minutes. A message sent from Mars does not arrive at mission control the moment it is transmitted. It arrives after a delay that can stretch to nearly half an hour. Then mission control responds. That response travels back at the same speed. The crew receives an answer somewhere between 6 and 44 minutes after they first asked the question. In an emergency, 44 minutes is not a communication delay, it is a verdict. Mission control for the Mars crew would operate differently than any other human spaceflight in history. The traditional model, where ground teams monitor every system in real time and call out corrections as situations develop, simply does not work across that kind of delay. The crew is on their own. They carry every procedure, every contingency plan, every technical manual in their heads or in the mission database they brought with them. When something goes wrong, they diagnose it, decide on a fix, and execute it, all before mission control even knows the problem exists. This fundamentally changes the psychology of the mission. Astronauts on the International Space Station operate with a safety net. If something unusual happens, they have experts available within seconds. That safety net shapes how crew members think about risk. They know help is close. Mars crew members will spend years operating with no functional safety net. every decision is final before Earth even hears about it. Researchers studying extreme isolation environments, including Antarctic winter-over crews and submarine crews on long patrols, have found that the psychological burden of operating without external support shifts over time. Initially, crews embrace the autonomy. As months pass, the weight of that self-reliance can become exhausting. Personal communication compounds the isolation. A crew member who wants to speak to their family faces the same delay. A message home saying good night arrives 22 minutes later. The response to that arrives 22 minutes after that. A conversation becomes a series of recorded messages exchanged hours apart. The emotional immediacy of human connection, the thing that makes talking to someone you love feel like the presence of another person, disappears entirely. Astronauts on long-duration missions have described this particular aspect of isolation as something they did not fully anticipate, even after extensive training. Knowing intellectually that you cannot have a real conversation with home is different from living it for years. The 22-minute wall is not a technical problem that engineering will solve. It is a physical law of the universe. No amount of improved technology changes the speed of light. The crew on Mars is alone in a way no human has ever been alone before, and the distance that creates that aloneness is permanent. What it does to a person over years is something researchers are only beginning to understand. There is a pattern in long-duration isolation missions that is so consistent researchers gave it a name. They call it the third quarter phenomenon. It does not hit in the first stretch of a mission, when everything is new and purpose feels sharp. It does not hit in the final stretch, when the end is visible and motivation returns. It hits in the middle, the long, flat, featureless middle. The pattern appears in Antarctic winter-over crews who spend months locked in research stations while the sun disappears and temperatures drop to levels that make going outside impossible. It appears in crews aboard submarines on extended patrols. It appeared in volunteers who spent simulated mission periods inside confined habitat modules as part of Mars mission research. In every case, the third quarter of the mission, roughly the midpoint to three-quarters mark, shows the sharpest increases in conflict, lowest morale, highest rates of depression, and most errors in task performance. For a Mars crew facing a 500-day surface stay, the third quarter lands somewhere around the 250 to 375-day mark. That is 8 to 12.5 months in. Deep into the mission, still far from any return window, the novelty has worn off completely. The excitement of the first discoveries is now routine. Every day looks like the previous day, inside a habitat the size of a house, surrounded by a landscape that does not change unless the crew goes out in suits to change it themselves. Interpersonal tension is one of the most documented consequences. Researchers studying confined group dynamics consistently find that small irritations, the way someone chews food, a difference in how tasks get prioritized, a perceived imbalance in workload, grow into significant conflicts when there is no escape from them. On Earth, you fight with a coworker and go home. On Mars, there is no going home. The person you argued with is sleeping 3 feet away. The psychological protocols for Mars missions are more detailed than any previous human spaceflight program. Crews train for years learning conflict resolution communication techniques under stress and how to maintain individual identity within a tightly confined group. They practice the specific scenario of a mission crisis during the third quarter, when team cohesion is most fragile and the stakes are highest. But training is not immunity. Human psychology is not a machine that can be calibrated and set to run perfectly under any conditions. The third quarter phenomenon shows up even in crews that were carefully selected, thoroughly trained, and highly motivated. The pattern is that consistent. Mission designers have responded by building deliberate rhythms into the schedule, planned events that break monotony, private communication windows that give each crew member dedicated time for personal contact with Earth, even across the delay, rotating responsibilities so that the same person is not doing the same task every single day. Work-to-rest ratios designed around the specific phase of the mission rather than a flat schedule. Whether those interventions are enough to prevent the third quarter from breaking a crew, on a world where there is absolutely no backup plan if it does, is something that will only be answered once a real crew goes through it. And what awaits them on the other side of that psychological threshold, deeper into the Martian surface, is a physical environment designed by the planet itself to make survival as difficult as possible. Close your eyes and picture the inside of a car, a regular car, parked in a quiet parking lot. That is roughly the amount of interior space each crew member on a Mars habitat module can expect to call their personal zone. Not a room, a zone, a defined area with boundaries that exist mostly as agreements between 6 people who have been living together for months with no way out. The habitat is not silent. That is one of the first things researchers who have lived inside analog habitat simulations report. Life support systems run continuously. Air recyclers push processed air through vents. Water reclamation units cycle through their cleaning sequences at regular intervals. Mechanical sounds become the ambient noise of survival, and after enough time, the human brain stops consciously hearing them, but they are always there. What the habitat lacks is variety. The sounds outside on the Martian surface are almost nothing. The atmosphere is so thin, about 1% of Earth's atmospheric density, that sound barely travels through it at all. Wind on Mars exists, but a gust that would rattle windows on Earth passes in near-complete silence on Mars. A dust devil sweeping across the plain would sound like a faint whisper if a crew member heard it through their suit. Mostly they would just see it. The visual environment does not offer much relief either. Mars is vast and visually stunning in photographs, with sweeping plains of rust-red rock, towering volcanic structures, and canyon systems that dwarf anything on Earth. But a crew confined to a habitat and the immediate surrounding area in spacesuits sees the same section of that terrain every day. The rocks do not move, the horizon does not change. The light shifts slowly over a Martian day that is almost identical in length to Earth's, 24 hours and 37 minutes, which is close enough to familiar to prevent complete disorientation, but different enough to slowly shift the body's circadian rhythm over time. Researchers who spent extended periods inside the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation Habitat, a geodesic dome on the slope of a Hawaiian volcano designed to simulate Mars surface conditions, consistently reported that the visual sameness was one of the hardest aspects of the simulation to prepare for. You can read about it, train for it, understand intellectually that the outside world will look identical every time you look at it. Actually living it across months is a different category of experience. The psychological term for what happens in environments with minimal sensory variation is stimulus deprivation. The brain is built to seek novelty. It evolved in an environment full of unpredictable inputs, changing weather, new landscapes, unfamiliar sounds, unexpected encounters. Strip all of that away, and the brain does not simply idle. It generates its own input. Crew members in long-duration simulations report vivid dreaming, intrusive thoughts, and a heightened emotional response to small events that would barely register in a normal environment. A minor disagreement inside the habitat carries emotional weight that a similar disagreement on Earth would not. A piece of personal mail, even a brief recorded message from home, arriving with a 22-minute delay, can become one of the most emotionally significant events of a week. The mind adapts. It finds meaning in small things. It builds rituals and routines that give structure to the monotony. It keeps the crew functional. But the adaptation itself has costs, and some of those costs compound quietly in the background while the crew is busy surviving. Mars looks simple from orbit, a dry, red-brown sphere with white polar caps and the occasional dark smear of ancient volcanic rock. From a distance, it looks like a place you could walk around on if you just had a good breathing mask and a warm jacket. The reality is something else entirely. The surface of Mars is covered in something called perchlorates. These are chlorine-containing compounds that form naturally in the Martian environment through chemical reactions in the atmosphere and soil. They are present across almost the entire surface of the planet, not just in isolated patches. Everywhere. Perchlorates are toxic to humans. Specifically, they disrupt the thyroid gland, which is the small organ in your neck that regulates metabolism, energy levels, and a range of other critical body functions. The thyroid absorbs iodine to do its job. Perchlorates chemically resemble iodine closely enough that the thyroid absorbs them instead. Once inside the gland, they block iodine uptake and interfere with hormone production. Long-term exposure causes the thyroid to malfunction, leading to fatigue, weight changes, cardiovascular problems, and in extreme cases, complete thyroid failure. This creates a serious contamination problem for the crew. The Martian dust that carries perchlorates is extraordinarily fine. The particles are smaller than talc. They cling to surfaces through electrostatic charge. A crew member, returning from an extravehicular activity, a surface walk in a spacesuit, brings dust back on the suit. Getting that dust off completely before entering the habitat is a real challenge that engineers are still working to solve. Current plans involve airlocks with pressurized air blowers and brushing systems designed to knock dust off suits before the inner door opens. The systems work for most of the dust most of the time. But in a fine particle environment, most of the time is not the same as all of the time. Over months and years of surface operations, perchlorate contamination inside the habitat is a genuine concern. The dust does not just threaten the crew biologically, it threatens the equipment. Martian dust is abrasive at the microscopic level. It is also electrostatically charged, which means it actively sticks to surfaces rather than simply settling on them. Solar panels coated in Martian dust lose efficiency. Optical sensors degrade. Mechanical seals that are repeatedly exposed to fine dust particles develop wear patterns that standard Earth-based testing does not fully predict. The rovers that have operated on the Martian surface have provided real data on how dust behaves over time. Some rovers have had solar panels cleaned by dust devils, which are spinning columns of low-pressure air that cross the surface and can, occasionally, brush dust off surfaces they pass over. A crewed mission cannot rely on dust devils as a maintenance strategy. Engineers are developing solutions: passive dust mitigation coatings, electrostatic dust repellent systems that use the same charge that causes the dust to stick to, actively repel it from critical surfaces. Some of these work in laboratory testing. None have been validated at scale in real Martian conditions. Every day on the surface, the crew lives inside a world that is actively trying to get into their equipment, into their habitat, and into their bodies. The poison in the dust is patient in a way that no other hazard on the mission is. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. There is a moment that every person who has looked at Mars surface imagery eventually reaches, the moment when the landscape stops looking alien and starts looking almost familiar. The rust-red plains, the scattered rocks, the low horizon. If you squint, it could almost be a desert in Arizona or New Mexico. Almost. Then the sun begins to set, and everything changes. On Earth, sunsets are red and orange because the atmosphere scatters blue wavelengths of light in all directions, leaving the longer red and orange wavelengths to dominate the colors near the horizon at dusk. Mars works in reverse. The Martian atmosphere is so thin and so loaded with fine iron oxide dust that it scatters light differently. Short wavelengths, the blues, are scattered forward and concentrated near the direction of the setting sun. The result is a halo of blue-grey light surrounding the disappearing sun as it drops below the horizon, surrounded by a pinkish-brown sky that fades to dark. Mars sunsets are blue. Real photographs taken by rovers confirmed this decades ago. If you stood on the Martian surface at dusk and watched the sun go down, you would see a distinctly blue glow fading at the horizon, while the rest of the sky turned a pale salmon color. This is not just a visual curiosity. For a crew living through months of psychological pressure, the visual environment carries real weight. Researchers who study the psychological effects of long-duration isolation have found that access to natural light cycles, and specifically to sunsets and sunrises, has measurable effects on mood and circadian health. The light cycle on Mars is close enough to Earth's that the basic rhythm is preserved. The light itself, filtered through that dusty, thin atmosphere, arrives dimmer and more orange-tinted than Earth daylight. The Martian day is called a sol. It is 24 hours and 37 minutes long. That extra 37 minutes accumulates. After 40 Earth days, the Martian clock has drifted by a full day compared to Earth time. Crews living on Martian time drift out of sync with Earth-based schedules gradually. Mission designers have proposed that crews adopt a fully Martian calendar, disconnecting from Earth time entirely to protect sleep cycles and maintain psychological grounding to the environment they are actually living in. The surface itself is visually alien in ways that photographs capture partially but cannot fully convey. Rocks are scattered across the terrain in patterns created by ancient floods, volcanic activity, and billions of years of wind erosion. The horizon sits closer than on Earth because of the planet's smaller radius, which changes the visual sense of scale. Things that look nearby can be miles away. Things that look small can be enormous. One of the most visually documented features of the Martian surface is Olympus Mons, a volcano so large it would not fit inside the continental United States. Its peak sits so high that it extends above most of the Martian atmosphere. From the base, you could not see the top because the slope rises so gradually over such an enormous distance that the curvature of the planet hides it. The crew lives in this alien landscape every day. They adapt to its rhythms. They learn its patterns. They begin to understand it in ways that no photograph or rover transmission can fully communicate. And with that understanding comes something unexpected. The planet starts to feel like home. Not Earth home. Something different. Something that belongs to them in a way nothing on Earth ever quite did. If the crew decides to come home, if the fuel is ready and the return vehicle is functional, and the launch window has opened and every system has performed flawlessly, they still have one final test waiting for them. Re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. A spacecraft returning from Mars arrives at Earth carrying enormous kinetic energy built up over months of falling through the inner solar system. At the moment it hits the top of the atmosphere, it is moving at somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 miles per hour. For comparison, a bullet fired from a rifle moves at roughly 2,000 miles per hour. The returning Mars capsule hits the atmosphere at 15 times that speed. The atmosphere does not slow the spacecraft gently, it creates friction. Enormous, violent planet-scale friction that heats the capsule's outer surface to temperatures comparable to the surface of the Sun. The heat shield on the front of the capsule is the only thing standing between the crew and that environment. It ablates, meaning it burns away layer by layer, absorbing heat and protecting the crew inside. It is engineered to do exactly this. It has been tested. It works. But a Mars return capsule faces conditions that Earth return capsules from low orbit do not. The entry speed is significantly higher because the spacecraft has fallen from much farther away. Higher speed means more energy, means more heat. The heat shield must be sized and designed for a more extreme environment than any previously flown human spacecraft. Engineers at multiple space agencies are designing exactly this. The physics are understood. The materials science is advancing. The engineering challenge is substantial, but solvable in principle. What is not solvable through engineering is the condition of the crew inside the capsule. These are people whose bodies have spent months in transit, years in partial gravity, and the entire mission in elevated radiation exposure. They are returning to full Earth gravity for the first time in years. As the deceleration forces build during re-entry, a healthy person experiences a maximum force of roughly 4 times their body weight during a typical capsule return. A crew with compromised bone density, weakened cardiovascular systems, and muscles adapted to 38% gravity experiencing that same force is a very different medical scenario. Returning astronauts from the International Space Station, after stays measured in months rather than years, are already assessed as high risk during re-entry and immediate post-landing recovery. Mars returnees would require an entirely new medical protocol that accounts for a level of physical adaptation that no doctor on Earth has yet treated. The capsule hits the parachutes, the speed drops, the ground comes up, the crew is home, technically, if they survive the landing sequence. What happens next is not a triumphant walk across a tarmac, it is a medical emergency dressed up as a homecoming. The people who emerge from that capsule will need extensive support just to stand upright. Some may not be able to. Their bodies landed on Earth, but part of them is still on Mars. And here is where the story turns in a direction that even the most optimistic mission planners have to acknowledge. Money does not stop space missions. The Apollo program cost the equivalent of over $150 billion in today's value, and it landed humans on the moon 6 times. When a civilization decides something matters enough, it finds the resources. The question for a Mars return mission is not whether the money exists somewhere in the global economy. The question is whether spending it on a return ticket makes sense when the same money could build something permanent. Estimates for a full round-trip crewed Mars mission land somewhere above $500 billion. That number is not a precise invoice. It is a realistic order of magnitude projection based on the cost of every component required: the launch vehicles, the interplanetary transit habitat, the surface systems, the return vehicle, the fuel infrastructure, and the years of development and testing required before any of it can be trusted with human lives. $500 billion is roughly the annual military budget of a major world power. It is more than the gross domestic product of most countries on Earth. It is a number that makes funding committees pause, regardless of how compelling the mission is. A one-way mission changes the arithmetic in a fundamental way. Remove the return vehicle, and you eliminate one of the most complex and expensive engineering challenges in the entire mission. Remove the need to pre-position return fuel on the surface, and you eliminate years of robotic supply missions to Mars before the crew even departs. Remove the mass of return propellant from the outbound spacecraft, and the launch requirements shrink dramatically, which reduces launch costs. Estimates suggest a one-way mission could cost somewhere between a third and a half of a full round-trip mission. That is not a minor savings. That is the difference between a budget that stretches the capacity of even the wealthiest institutions and a budget that is difficult but achievable within a realistic funding timeline. The savings do not disappear, they get redirected. The resources that would have gone into a return vehicle instead go into surface infrastructure, more habitat modules, better water recycling systems, more powerful solar arrays or a compact nuclear reactor, agricultural systems for growing food, medical equipment for long-term care, communication systems designed for years of continuous operation rather than the duration of a brief surface stay. A one-way mission is not a cheaper version of a Mars visit. It is a more expensive version of the first phase of permanent settlement. The money is not saved by sending fewer resources. It is redirected from the act of leaving to the act of staying. For space agencies trying to justify Mars funding to governments and taxpayers, the narrative around permanent settlement also carries different weight than the narrative around a brief visit. A crewed round trip to Mars produces data, photographs, and a historic achievement. A permanent settlement produces the beginning of a multi-generational presence on another world. The second argument is harder to attach a price tag to, which is both its political weakness and its ultimate strength. The financial logic alone does not decide whether the mission is one-way or round-trip, but it shapes every conversation about what is realistic, what is achievable within a reasonable timeline, and what humanity actually gets for the investment. And when the financial logic lines up with the biological evidence and the engineering constraints, the conclusion those three forces push toward is the same one. A return rocket is heavy, a fully fueled interplanetary return vehicle capable of lifting 6 people off the Martian surface and pushing them through space for 9 months back to Earth, represents an enormous amount of mass. Every kilogram of that mass that travels to Mars on the outbound journey has a cost. Every kilogram that has to be manufactured on Mars from local resources requires infrastructure that has not been built yet. Strip that mass requirement out of the mission plan, and something interesting happens. You have room for other things. Mission designers who have modeled one-way versus round-trip payloads have worked out what a permanent settlement-focused mission could carry instead. The numbers shift the mission profile dramatically. The mass freed up by eliminating the return vehicle and its fuel infrastructure can carry years of additional food supply. Current estimates for feeding a Mars crew suggest roughly 4.5 pounds of food per person per day. A 6-person crew consumes roughly 27 pounds of food daily. Over 2 years, that is nearly 20,000 pounds of food. A return mission profile allocates a fraction of that because the crew is expected to leave before supplies run critically low. A settlement profile carries enough to sustain the crew through multiple crop failures as they develop their own food production systems. It can carry expanded medical equipment. A round-trip mission carries the minimum medical kit required to handle likely emergencies during the mission duration. A permanent settlement needs surgical capability, dental equipment, diagnostic tools for long-term health monitoring, and pharmaceutical stores for managing chronic conditions that develop over years of living in a hostile environment. The mass difference between a mission medical kit and a settlement medical bay is significant. It can carry agricultural modules. Growing food on Mars is not optional for a permanent settlement. It is the difference between a mission that survives on brought supplies and one that becomes self-sustaining. Hydroponic systems that grow crops in controlled environments without soil have been tested extensively in Earth-based research stations. Scaled versions for Mars require growing space, lighting systems, water recycling, and nutrient management equipment. All of that takes mass and volume. A one-way mission can allocate it. It can carry the beginning of a manufacturing capability, spare parts, raw material processing equipment, tools for working with Martian rock and regolith, electronics fabrication basics. A settlement that cannot produce or repair its own components eventually runs out of the ones it brought. The math of a one-way mission is not about subtraction, it is about substitution. Every kilogram that stops being a return ticket becomes a kilogram of future. More food, more medicine, more capability, more time. A round-trip mission extracts the crew from Mars and brings them home with data. A one-way mission leaves the crew on Mars with the tools to build something that lasts beyond the mission itself. The moment you stop planning to leave, the entire resource calculation changes, and so does what the mission is actually for. In the hills above Mauna Loa, Hawaii's largest volcano, sits a small white dome roughly the size of a 2-car garage. It has a small airlock. Its windows are small and covered. The view from inside is deliberately limited. Researchers use it to simulate a Mars surface habitat, and volunteers who agree to live inside it treat it like the real thing. No going outside without a simulated spacesuit. No fresh food. No private phone calls. No visitors. Just 6 people, a contained space, and as close to the isolation of Mars as you can create on Earth. The Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation Program has run multiple missions. The longest lasted over a year. The volunteers were selected carefully, trained extensively, and monitored throughout. What they discovered could not be fully trained for. The first weeks were energizing. The novelty of the mission, the sense of purpose, the structured daily routines kept the group cohesive and focused. By the second month, patterns began emerging that the team had not fully anticipated. Small decisions became disproportionately important. Who handled which task? How shared spaces were used? How much noise was acceptable during personal time? All of these became sources of friction. By the 4th and 5th month, something researchers called social saturation set in. The volunteers had simply been exposed to each other too much for too long, with no relief. Every personality trait that might be mildly irritating in a normal social context had been amplified by repetition and confinement. The most patient members of the crew found themselves reacting to minor things with more emotion than the situations warranted. Privacy, or the illusion of it, became critical. Crews developed informal rules about when and how to signal that someone needed space within a space that offered almost none. Headphones in meant, "Do not talk to me." A certain position in the sleeping area meant, "Leave this person alone." The group created a microculture with its own social language, because the alternative was constant low-grade conflict that would eventually be unmanageable. Food took on enormous psychological importance. Meals were the primary social ritual. The preparation, the eating, the cleanup, these became events rather than tasks. Volunteers reported that the quality and variety of available food had an outsized effect on morale compared to what anyone expected going in. Communication with the outside world was structured to simulate the Mars delay. Messages went out and came back with a time lag. Volunteers described the effect as a kind of emotional untethering. Knowing that a conversation with someone you love cannot be real time, that your words go out and wait and come back altered by the delay, changes the psychological texture of the relationship over time. One extended simulation crew reported that by the end of their mission, they had developed a social system inside the dome that felt self-contained in a way none of them had anticipated. Earth had receded not just physically, but psychologically. The dome was the world. The 6 people inside it were the population of that world. The things that happened inside mattered enormously. The things happening outside felt distant and abstract. Researchers noted that this psychological shift from Earth orientation to habitat orientation happened faster than expected and more completely than the crew members had predicted for themselves before entry. On actual Mars, with no exit door and no end date on the horizon, that shift would happen faster still, and it would be permanent. The surface of Mars has never seen a human birth. It has never seen human childhood. It has never seen the biological process by which one generation produces the next. Every model of a permanent Mars settlement eventually arrives at this question. And the honest answer is that nobody knows what happens. Human reproduction has never been studied in a reduced gravity environment. The ethical and practical barriers to conducting that research in zero gravity or partial gravity are significant. No space agency has tested whether embryo development, pregnancy, or birth are survivable away from Earth's gravity. The data does not exist because the experiments have not been done. What scientists do know comes from animal studies. Experiments conducted aboard orbiting platforms using simpler organisms have shown that early embryonic development is sensitive to gravitational environment. Some studies showed altered development patterns in organisms grown in microgravity compared to those grown under normal conditions. These organisms are not humans. The complexity difference is enormous, but the underlying biological processes, cell division, tissue differentiation, organ formation, share fundamental mechanisms across species. The specific concern for Mars is that at 38% gravity, the developmental signals that depend on gravitational load may not function correctly. Bone and muscle formation in a fetus respond to mechanical forces. A growing body in 38% gravity is receiving different mechanical signals than one developing on Earth. What that means for the resulting child is unknown. The cardiovascular system is another area of concern. The heart and circulatory system develop partly in response to the gravitational demands they will need to meet. A child born and raised in 38% gravity may develop a cardiovascular system optimized for that environment. Whether that system could ever function in Earth gravity is an open question. A Mars-born human might be permanently adapted to Mars gravity in a way that makes them biologically incompatible with Earth. This possibility has significant implications for the concept of a permanent settlement. A self-sustaining Mars colony requires reproduction. Reproduction requires that pregnancy and birth are survivable on Mars. And if the children born on Mars are fundamentally different from Earth humans, then the settlement is not just a branch of humanity relocated to another planet. It is the beginning of a separate branch of the human species. Researchers studying the long arc of human evolution note that geographic isolation is one of the primary drivers of speciation. Populations that are cut off from each other long enough develop differently. Mars is the most extreme version of geographic isolation imaginable. A Martian population that cannot reproduce with Earth humans, or that physically cannot survive on Earth, would represent the first intentional divergence of the human species since modern humans emerged. That possibility is not science fiction. It is a biological consequence of the physics of the mission. No one designed it that way. It would simply happen over generations as the planet shaped the people who were born on it. The first generation goes to Mars by choice. The second generation is born there without one. That asymmetry is one of the deepest ethical questions the mission raises, and it has no clean answer. A Mars habitat sitting on the surface is exposed to two of the most dangerous things the environment can deliver: cosmic radiation from deep space and solar particle events from an active sun. The atmosphere provides almost no shielding. The planet has no magnetic field to deflect incoming particles. Every hour spent in an unshielded surface habitat is an hour of radiation accumulation. Engineers designing the shielding solutions for a permanent settlement have looked at every available material on Mars and asked what can be used to build a barrier between the crew and the radiation above them. The answer they keep coming back to is water. Water is one of the best radiation shielding materials available. Hydrogen atoms, which make up 2 of the 3 atoms in every water molecule, are particularly effective at absorbing and scattering the type of particles that make up galactic cosmic rays. A thick layer of water or ice between a habitat and the sky above absorbs a significant portion of the incoming radiation before it reaches the crew. Mars has water, large amounts of it, frozen into the polar ice caps and buried as permafrost beneath the surface across much of the planet. Some regions have ice deposits close enough to the surface that robotic equipment could access them without deep excavation. The plan for several Mars habitat designs involves covering the pressurized living modules with a layer of Martian ice several feet thick, using the planet's own frozen water as a radiation shield. The concept works physically. Ice shielding of sufficient thickness can reduce surface radiation exposure to levels closer to what astronauts experience aboard the International Space Station, which is itself elevated compared to Earth's surface, but manageable for extended periods. The engineering challenge is getting the ice where it needs to be. Covering a habitat module requires moving and placing large volumes of ice using robotic equipment that operates in temperatures that can drop below -100 degrees Fahrenheit at night. The equipment has to function reliably in those conditions. The ice layer has to be maintained over years as the habitat is used and modified. Some designs take the shielding concept further by planning underground construction. If a crew can excavate into the Martian subsurface and build habitat structures below ground level, the rock and regolith above provides natural shielding comparable to or better than what an ice layer offers. Subsurface construction also provides insulation against the extreme temperature swings between Martian day and night. The trade-off is complexity. Underground construction on Mars requires excavation equipment, structural support systems to prevent tunnel collapse, and interior pressurization that accounts for the different stress loads on a buried structure compared to a surface one. None of this is simple. All of it is achievable in principle, given the right tools and sufficient preparation time. The shielding problem has solutions. They are not easy or cheap or quick, but they are solvable in a way that some of the other challenges of permanent Mars settlement are not. The raw materials are there. The physics work. The engineering is hard. And the alternative, leaving the crew exposed on the surface, is not an option for a mission measured in years or decades. Water on Mars does not come out of a tap. It does not fall from the sky in any useful quantity. The atmosphere is so thin and so cold that liquid water cannot exist on the surface. It sublimates, meaning ice converts directly to water vapor without passing through a liquid phase, or it freezes solid before it can do anything useful. What Mars has is water locked into ice and chemically bound into minerals in the soil. Getting it out requires work. The primary method mission designers are developing is thermal extraction. Rovers or stationary processing units drive over the surface, collect Martian soil called regolith, and heat it inside sealed containers. The heat drives water vapor out of the mineral structure of the soil, and that vapor is captured, cooled, and condensed into liquid water. The system works, demonstrated at small scale in laboratory conditions using simulated Martian soil. The yield varies significantly depending on where the extraction happens. Soil near the poles and at higher latitudes contains more water ice than equatorial regions. Near the poles, some areas have subsurface ice just inches below the surface. In other regions, the water content of the soil is low enough that you would need to process enormous volumes to collect useful quantities. For a 6-person crew, daily water requirements for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene amount to roughly 2 gallons per person. That is 12 gallons per day, assuming strict rationing with no water wasted. Real settlements would need more, factoring in water for agricultural systems, equipment cooling, and chemical processes. Water recycling is essential. The habitat systems would recover and purify water from every source available. Crew respiration, urine, cooking steam, equipment condensation, everything loops back. Even with aggressive recycling, the system loses water over time through inevitable inefficiencies. Periodic extraction from the Martian environment compensates for those losses. The extraction equipment runs continuously, slowly building reserves and replacing what the recycling system cannot recover. Beyond drinking water, water serves another critical purpose that shapes the entire settlement strategy. Split water into its component elements using electrolysis, and you get hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen feeds the habitat life support system. Hydrogen, combined with carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere, through the chemical process discussed in an earlier chapter, becomes methane for fuel. Water is not just a survival resource on Mars. It is the foundation of the entire energy and propulsion economy of the settlement. The locations on Mars with the most accessible water ice are therefore among the most strategically valuable real estate on the planet. Mission planners treat water access as a primary constraint on habitat placement. You land where the water is, not necessarily where the terrain is flattest or most convenient for other purposes. Extraction at scale requires infrastructure that takes years to establish. In the early phases of a settlement, the crew manages on brought supplies and minimal extraction. Over time, as equipment accumulates and systems mature, the settlement's water independence grows. The goal is a point where the colony produces more water than it consumes, banking reserves for emergencies and expansion. Every cup of water the crew drinks on Mars was extracted from frozen rock using machines running in an environment that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. That is the supply chain. It is slow, it is fragile, and it is the only one available. The sun is not always calm. It is a churning nuclear furnace with a surface that periodically erupts in massive explosions of energy and magnetized plasma. These eruptions are called solar flares and coronal mass ejections. On Earth, they cause beautiful auroras near the poles and occasionally disrupt radio communications and power grids. The planet's magnetic field deflects most of the dangerous particles. What gets through is absorbed by the atmosphere. Mars has neither of those protections. When a major solar particle event hits Mars, high-energy protons and electrons from the ejection arrive at the surface with very little to stop them. The thin atmosphere absorbs a small fraction. The rest hits everything on or near the surface with the full force of the ejection. For unshielded electronics, a major event can induce electrical currents strong enough to damage or destroy sensitive components. Rovers on the Martian surface have documented elevated radiation readings during solar events that would be dangerous to any crew member caught outside. The warning system exists, but has limits. Scientists on Earth monitor the sun continuously and can detect the signatures of a major ejection. As it happens, the light from the event travels at the speed of light and reaches Mars in about 8 minutes. The particle cloud from the ejection travels slower, typically arriving anywhere from 1 to 3 days after the initial flash. That window is the warning time. For a crew on Mars, receiving warning of an incoming solar particle event triggers a specific response: get underground or get behind the ice shielding as fast as possible. The most shielded area of the habitat becomes a storm shelter. The crew stays inside until the event passes, which can take hours or, in rare cases. The danger is not just to the crew. During a major event, unshielded surface equipment takes damage. Solar panels degrade faster under elevated radiation. The electronics in rovers and external monitoring systems are at risk. If a crew member is caught outside in a spacesuit during a major event with no immediate shelter available, the radiation dose received could be significant enough to cause acute radiation sickness within hours. Mission planners are designing Mars habitats with dedicated storm shelters that can be reached quickly from any part of the surface operation zone. Any area where crew members work regularly must have a path to shelter that can be completed within the warning window. Surface excursions planned during periods of elevated solar activity would be cancelled or shortened. The monitoring of solar activity from Mars itself is another engineering requirement. Earth-based observatories provide coverage, but the communication delay means a warning relayed through Earth arrives slower than a direct local observation would. The settlement needs its own solar monitoring capability to maximize the time available for sheltering decisions. Every day the crew works on the surface, a fraction of their mental bandwidth goes toward watching the sky. Not the blue Martian sky, the invisible sky, the one that carries what cannot be seen until it is already hitting everything. The first permanent Mars settlement will not look like the ones in movies. No gleaming towers, no expansive domes with perfect gardens visible through transparent walls. The first real city on Mars will be small, buried, deliberately unglamorous, and built primarily to keep 6 people alive long enough to build more of it. The architecture of survival on Mars starts underground. Below the surface, the crew gains natural radiation shielding from the rock and regolith above them. They gain insulation from the brutal temperature swings that take the surface from 50 degrees Fahrenheit at noon to negative 100 degrees at night. They gain protection from dust storms that can last for months and from the micrometeorite impacts that a thin atmosphere does not stop. The primary living structure in most serious settlement designs is a pressurized tunnel network connected to surface airlocks and expandable habitat modules. The tunnels are the spine of the settlement. Individual habitat modules attach to the network like rooms off a corridor. As more modules are delivered from Earth in the years following the first crew, the network grows. Building the tunnel network requires excavation. Mars has no ready-made caves in the convenient locations needed, though lava tubes from ancient volcanic activity do exist and have been considered as natural shelters. Excavating purpose-built tunnels requires machinery capable of cutting through Martian rock and removing the debris efficiently. That machinery has to be robust enough to operate for years without factory-level maintenance. The pressurized interior of the settlement operates at an atmospheric pressure comfortable for humans. Maintaining that pressure requires constant monitoring. The habitat walls push outward against vacuum. Every seal, every joint, every connection point between modules is a potential leak. Even microscopic leaks accumulate into measurable atmosphere loss over time. The crew's air supply is finite. Leaks that cannot be found and fixed eventually reduce habitat pressure to dangerous levels, Manufacturing capabilities grow with the settlement. Early phases depend entirely on supplies from Earth. Later phases begin using Martian materials. Regolith processed into building materials reduces the dependency on launched mass. Metal extraction from Martian rock provides raw material for repairs and eventually for construction. The settlement builds toward a state where each Earth supply delivery supplements rather than sustains the colony. Power generation is the single most critical infrastructure element. Without power, everything fails. Life support stops, water extraction stops, communication stops. Settlement designs that rely solely on solar panels face the challenge of months-long dust storms that can reduce solar panel output by 95%. Nuclear power sources, compact reactors that operate independently of sunlight, are the most robust solution and the most likely power backbone for any serious permanent settlement. The first city on Mars will be measured in rooms before it is measured in blocks. Its population will be counted in single digits before it reaches dozens. Its construction timeline is measured in decades, but it starts with 6 people in a buried pressurized module, building something that no human being has ever built before, on a planet that never asked them to come and will not make it easy now that they are there. Generations pass slowly. The first crew lands on Mars. They are explorers, scientists, engineers, chosen from a planet of 8 billion people after years of competition and preparation. They arrive carrying Earth in everything they are: their accents, their food preferences, their instinctive sense of what a normal sky looks like, their gut-level understanding of how seasons work, all of it built on Earth. Their children, if children come, will have none of that foundation. A child born on Mars will grow up under a sky that is pale salmon and brown, not blue. They will never feel rain. They will never see an ocean. They will never walk barefoot on grass or feel wind on their face without a suit between them and the atmosphere. The gravity they learn to walk in will be less than half what their parents grew up in. Their entire sensory vocabulary for what the world feels and looks like will be built from Mars. Psychologists and anthropologists studying the implications of this have described the Mars-born generation as the first people who will experience a complete break in the continuity of human environmental experience. Every human being alive today, regardless of where they grew up, shares a common sensory baseline: one gravity, liquid water, a breathable atmosphere they can step into freely, a sky that is blue in daylight. Those experiences are so universal they shape how humans think about basic concepts like up and down, near and far, inside and outside. A Mars-born child will not share those references. Their understanding of inside versus outside will carry a weight that Earth-raised people will never fully grasp. Outside is where you die without a suit. Outside is not a comfortable extension of inside. It is a separate category, managed with technology and caution. The language they develop will reflect this. New words for new concepts. A different emotional register around weather, around distance, around what counts as a journey. Their relationship to Earth will be similar to how most people alive today relate to their great-grandparents' home country. A place of origin that is real in history, but not in lived experience. Biologically, the story is more dramatic. Bodies shaped by 38% gravity from birth will be different from Earth bodies in measurable ways. Taller, likely, because lower gravity exerts less compressive force on the growing spine. Different cardiovascular profiles, built for a lower demand circulatory environment. Skeletal structures that carry the same genetic blueprint as their parents, but have been shaped by different forces. Whether a Mars-born generation could visit Earth is unclear. Whether they would want to is a different question entirely. Earth would be, to them, the ancestral planet, the original home of their species, a place of overwhelming gravity, unpredictable weather, enormous biodiversity, and a population of 8 billion people who have never been where they came from. Some might feel the pull of that origin, Others might feel nothing more than curiosity about a planet their bodies were never built for. The first true Martians will define what it means to be human in a way that reaches beyond anything the founding crew imagined when they first touched down on the rust-red surface and looked up at a blue sunset. Antarctic research stations have been producing some of the most useful psychological data for Mars mission planning for decades. Not because the Antarctic environment is similar to Mars, but because the isolation is structurally comparable. A small team of people in a hostile environment, cut off from the rest of the world for months, unable to leave regardless of how they feel about being there. Researchers who have studied winter-over crews at Antarctic stations have documented a consistent psychological progression. In the early weeks of isolation, crew members maintain strong mental connections to their home lives. They think about family frequently. They follow news from home carefully. They feel the absence of their normal world as something acute and immediate. By the halfway mark, those connections begin to shift. News from home becomes less urgent. The emotional weight of events happening outside the station diminishes. The crew's social and psychological world contracts around the people and the place they are actually in. The outside world does not disappear from their minds, but it recedes. It loses the texture of something real and immediate and takes on the quality of something known but not felt. By the end of a year, some winter-over crew members describe a surprising difficulty re-engaging with the outside world, even after returning to it. The social norms they left behind feel arbitrary. The noise and stimulation of normal life feels overwhelming. The tight, purposeful community of the station had become, in a deep psychological sense, home. For a Mars crew, the same process would unfold faster and more completely. The distance is not 300 miles of ice, reachable by aircraft in a weather window. It is 140 million miles of vacuum. The crew cannot leave. Earth cannot reach them. The communication delay prevents any real sense of ongoing connection to what they left behind. Within months, Earth becomes something the crew talks about, rather than something they feel part of. Within a year, the references shift. Earth is where they came from, not where they are going back to. The habitat and the surface and the 6 people sharing both become the complete social universe of the crew's daily experience. This shift is not pathological, it is adaptive. The brain responds to the world it is actually living in. Maintaining intense emotional investment in a place that cannot be accessed, reached, or experienced in any direct way is psychologically unsustainable. The mind redirects that investment toward what is present and real. What this means practically is that the crew that lands on Mars and the crew that might theoretically try to return years later are psychologically different groups of people. The returning crew would not be going home in the way that word implies for most people. They would be going to a planet they remember from before they became who they are now. The friends and family they left behind have changed. The culture has moved on. The crew has been reshaped by years on another world. Some researchers who study extreme isolation describe this as psychological emigration. The body stays in place. The internal sense of belonging completes a journey that is one way, regardless of where the spacecraft ends up landing. In 1998, at a space development conference, a man named Bruce Mackenzie stood up and made an argument that most people in the room considered extreme. He proposed that humanity's first Mars missions should be explicitly designed as one-way settlement trips. The goal was not to visit Mars and return with data. The goal was to go and build something that did not require anyone to come back. Mackenzie's argument was methodical. He laid out the cost differential between a visit and a settlement. He walked through the engineering savings from removing the return vehicle. He argued that the history of human exploration showed that permanent settlement had always been more achievable and more productive than expeditions designed around return. Columbus did not sail to the Americas planning to stay. The Pilgrims did. One of those approaches produced a civilization. The audience did not immediately agree. The idea of sending people somewhere with no mechanism for return triggered deep discomfort in a room full of professionals who had spent careers thinking about mission safety and crew survival. The entire architecture of human spaceflight up to that point had been built around the axiom that getting the crew home was the primary mission objective. Mackenzie challenged that axiom directly. He was not arguing for abandoning the crew. He was arguing for a different definition of what success looked like. Success was not bringing the crew home. Success was establishing a permanent human presence on another planet. The crew came home in a different sense, by building the place they were already in into something worth living in. The proposal was formal enough to be published, specific enough to be taken seriously by researchers who followed it, and controversial enough to generate the kind of pushback that eventually advances a field. In the years after, the one-way mission concept moved from fringe position to legitimate area of study within space exploration planning circles. By 2014, Buzz Aldrin, the second human to walk on the moon, and one of the most respected voices in spaceflight history, made essentially the same argument publicly. The people who go to Mars should plan to stay. Aldrin framed it not as a sacrifice, but as the appropriate response to the scale of the challenge. Pilgrims do not take return tickets. Settlers do not keep a ship fueled at the dock. The shift in mainstream discussion was gradual but measurable. Academic papers began engaging with one-way mission architectures seriously. Mission planning documents from major space agencies started including permanent settlement as an explicit long-term objective rather than a distant afterthought. The conversation moved from whether a one-way mission was ethical to whether it was practical, which is a significant shift in how seriously an idea is being considered. Mackenzie's 1998 talk did not cause all of that, but it was part of the intellectual chain that normalized the question. Someone had to say it out loud, formally, at a conference, with numbers and logic behind it. Someone had to make the case that staying was not failure, that leaving was not the point. Every long-duration mission must plan for it. No mission planner wants to discuss it openly, but every serious Mars mission architecture includes contingency planning for crew death. In low Earth orbit, a medical emergency can sometimes be resolved by returning the affected crew member to Earth within hours. On the International Space Station, a Soyuz capsule sits docked and ready as a lifeboat. The response time from emergency to Earth's surface is measured in hours. On Mars, there is no lifeboat. There is no emergency return. If a crew member dies, whether from an accident, an illness, a catastrophic equipment failure, or any other cause, the remaining crew deals with it on their own, millions of miles from any outside support. The medical realities of a Mars settlement mean that some conditions that would be survivable on Earth become fatal on Mars. A surgical emergency that requires a specialist on Earth must be handled by whoever on the crew has the most medical training. The medical bay on a Mars settlement is not a hospital. It is a well-equipped clinic staffed by capable but not fully specialized people operating under enormous pressure with no option to refer the patient somewhere better equipped. Medications have finite shelf lives. Surgical supplies are limited. Diagnostic equipment covers the most likely scenarios but cannot cover every possible one. The crew arrives with the medical resources they brought and the skills they trained for. Over years, both deplete. The psychological impact of a crew death in a 6-person settlement is different from a crew death in any other mission context. These 6 people are each other's entire social world. They have lived in extremely close proximity for months or years. A death does not remove one member of a team. It removes 1/6 of the total human presence in the settlement. The remaining 5 people continue living in the space the deceased person occupied, using the equipment they used, passing their bunk every night. The grief protocols being developed for Mars missions go far beyond what any previous space program has needed to address. Researchers studying extreme isolation environments note that grief in total isolation, with no community outside the group to absorb some of the loss, is processed differently than grief in a normal social context. The remaining crew cannot step away from the environment where the loss occurred. there is nowhere to go. The practical questions are also significant. What happens to the personal effects? How does the group mark the death formally, culturally, with meaning? What do they do with the remains in an environment where Earth-style burial is not straightforward and where every resource has survival value? These are not abstract philosophical questions for mission planners. They are protocol items that need answers before the first crew departs. The crew that stays on Mars permanently accepts, in some part of their awareness, that this is where they will die. Not tomorrow, not necessarily soon, but eventually and finally. Mars is where their story ends. Some find that acceptance clarifying. It removes a category of uncertainty and focuses the remaining time on what can be built within it. A standard vacuum cleaner filter is designed to capture particles down to a certain size. It catches most household dust. The particles it misses are small enough to pass through and get redistributed into the air. Martian dust particles are far smaller than that. They are smaller than most medical-grade air filters are designed to catch, and they carry an electrostatic charge that makes them actively seek out surfaces to cling to. Over the course of a long surface mission, Martian dust infiltrates everything it can reach. The exterior of the habitat accumulates layers that reduce the reflectivity of solar panels and the sensitivity of optical sensors. The airlocks, which are supposed to prevent outside material from entering the habitat, handle most of the dust most of the time, but the Martian dust finds the gaps that normal engineering tolerances consider acceptable. The seals that work perfectly on Earth, in controlled laboratory conditions, perform differently after months of exposure to a dust particle that is electrostatically aggressive and microscopically small. Inside the habitat, trace amounts of dust that have made it through the airlock procedures settle on every surface. The recycled air system filters it out continuously, but filtration systems have finite capacity and require maintenance. The filters themselves become contaminated over time. Replacing them requires filter media that was either brought from Earth or manufactured on Mars, and neither source is unlimited. The mechanical systems suffer a parallel problem. Any moving part exposed to the Martian environment, joints in spacesuits, seals on sample containers, bearings and equipment that operates outside the habitat, accumulates dust in the tolerances between surfaces. Dust is abrasive at the microscopic level. Over thousands of operational cycles, that abrasion creates wear that was not accounted for in Earth-based testing, because the Earth-based testing did not include Martian dust at Martian electrostatic charge levels at Martian temperatures across the full operational lifetime of the equipment. Mars rover missions have provided some of the most important data on long-term dust effects. The Opportunity rover was designed for a 90-day mission. It operated for nearly 15 years before a global dust storm coated its solar panels beyond recovery. That outcome was positive from a dust standpoint. The rover survived far longer than expected. But a crewed settlement operates at a different scale of complexity and has human lives depending on systems that cannot simply be left stationary until a dust devil cleans them. Settlement planners are taking multiple approaches to the dust problem. Electrostatic active dust shields that use the same charge causing the dust to adhere to, instead repel it from critical surfaces. Pressurized suit donning areas that keep the primary habitat sealed even further from external contamination. Regular scheduled maintenance intervals for all exterior equipment, and acceptance that some degradation is unavoidable, with redundant systems to cover the functions of anything that fails. No engineering solution eliminates the dust. The dust is a permanent feature of the Martian environment. It does not solve itself. It does not wash away in rain. It does not settle permanently and stop moving. Wind redistributes it continuously. New dust from geological erosion and micrometeorite impact constantly adds to the supply. The settlement does not defeat the dust. It manages it indefinitely, with no finish line. The first generation arrives by choice. They volunteered. They trained. They signed whatever legal and personal agreements the mission required. They knew, or thought they knew, what they were accepting. The second generation never signs anything. A child born on Mars inherits a situation they did not choose and cannot change. They are citizens of a settlement that depends on their survival and eventually on their contribution. They grow up in a community small enough that every person's role is visible and necessary. There is no anonymity on Mars. There is no room for opting out of participation in the collective project of staying alive. Their education happens in whatever learning environment the settlement can provide. Their teachers are the crew members who came from Earth, people trained as engineers and scientists and doctors rather than educators. The curriculum is shaped by survival necessity first and intellectual development second. They learn what the settlement needs them to know. Practical skills, technical competencies, the systems and processes that keep the habitat functioning. But children are not machines. They will have questions that the practical curriculum does not answer. They will develop interests that do not align neatly with settlement needs. They will have relationships and conflicts and creative impulses, and existential questions that no mission document prepared anyone to handle. The psychological development of a child in an environment that has never raised a child before is entirely uncharted. The question of personal freedom on Mars is genuinely complicated. Can a Mars-born person choose to leave? Technically, in the early phases of the settlement, the answer is no. There is no commercial flight home. There is no mechanism for individual departure independent of a scheduled mission return window that may or may not exist. A Mars-born person who wants to go to Earth faces the same physical and financial barriers as anyone else who wants to make an interplanetary journey. If those barriers lower over time as the settlement matures and mission frequency increases, the question becomes cultural rather than logistical. Would a person raised entirely on Mars want to go to Earth? Would they have any practical ability to survive in one full gravity? Would Earth's scale, its population density, its noise and biological richness feel welcoming or overwhelming to someone whose entire lived experience fits inside a pressurized structure beneath the Martian surface? The most likely answer, based on what psychology knows about identity formation and attachment to place, is that Mars-born individuals would have deeply complex relationships with the idea of Earth. It would be the origin point of their species and the source of much of the knowledge and culture they inherited. It would also be a place they had never experienced, that their bodies might not be built for, and that could never feel like home in the way that their settlement does. They would be the first humans in history for whom the ancestral home of the species was not their home. Every human before them, regardless of where they were born, shared a planet. The children of Mars would be the first exceptions, and that exception would define everything about who they became. Every spacecraft has a moment during descent when the crew passes a threshold that eliminates options. Before that moment, an abort is possible. After it, the physics of the situation have made the decision for everyone. The spacecraft is going down regardless of any preference anyone inside it might have. For the Mars mission, this moment has a name in mission planning discussions. Engineers and mission architects call it entry interface, the point where the spacecraft's trajectory becomes irreversible in the Martian atmosphere. At entry interface, the heat shield is doing its job, the parachutes are preparing to deploy, the retro rockets are staged and ready, the crew is committed. The next stop is the Martian surface, but the deeper point of no return is not atmospheric. It happens earlier, the moment the crew lands successfully and the mission transitions from transit to surface operations. A quiet calculation shifts. The return vehicle is either pre-positioned and fueled, a massive conditional that has been discussed in previous chapters, or it is not. The planetary alignment clock starts running. The supplies are finite. The mission is live. In the hours after landing, the crew goes through their checklists. They confirm habitat pressure. They activate life support. They begin the systematic process of establishing a working base. They are busy. The work keeps the weight of the moment at a manageable distance. But at some point in the first days, each crew member will have a private moment of reckoning. The ground is real beneath their feet. The habitat is real around them. Earth is a dot in the sky that they can find if they know where to look. The return window is months away at minimum, years away in practice. The mission parameters they trained for are the parameters they are living. Mission psychologists studying crew adjustment to extreme environment transitions call this the reality integration phase. The intellectual understanding of what the mission means meets the physical experience of actually being in it. For most crew members, this integration takes between 2 and 6 weeks. The brain catches up to what the body already knows. This is where we are, and this is where we will be for a long time. For a crew that has been selected and trained for permanent settlement, the integration is qualitatively different. There is no return to integrate the reality against. The mission is open-ended. The only defined endpoints are the ones the settlement itself creates over time. The Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon did so knowing they were going home in days. Their experience of the lunar surface was filtered through that knowledge. Every sample collected, every photograph taken, every footstep was part of a brief window that would close and deposit them back into the familiar world they came from. The first permanent Mars crew has no such filter. Every sample collected, every photograph taken, every footstep is part of a permanent relationship with the place they are standing. The decisions they make are not about what to accomplish before departure, they are about what to build before tomorrow. The point of no return is not a moment of tragedy. For the people who volunteered for this, and trained for this, and chose this, it is the moment the mission finally becomes real. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it is the actual work that history will measure them by. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 6 miles wide entered Earth's atmosphere at an angle and hit what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons simultaneously. The resulting fires, debris cloud, and global temperature shift eliminated roughly 3/4 of all species on Earth, including every non-avian dinosaur. The planet itself survived. Most of the life on it did not. The event was not scheduled. There was no warning period. There was no mechanism by which any species could have prepared. The only reason any life survived at all was biodiversity and geographic distribution. Species present in enough different locations survived in some of those locations, even as others were destroyed. This is the argument that underlies every serious long-term justification for permanent Mars settlement. Not exploration, not science, not national prestige, survival insurance. Earth faces a range of extinction-level risks that are real, documented, and not fully preventable with current technology. Asteroid impacts are the most cinematic example, but not the only one. Supervolcanic eruptions can release enough material to block sunlight globally for years, causing crop failures across entire continents. Pandemic events that outpace medical response. Climate shifts that cross thresholds, triggering cascading system failures. The eventual evolution of the Sun toward a red giant, which will make Earth uninhabitable in roughly 5 billion years. A time frame that sounds irrelevant but represents the ultimate deadline for a species that wants to continue. A civilization confined to a single planet has a single point of failure. Every threat that is global in scale is existential in consequence. There is no backup. There is no recovery location. If Earth fails, humanity fails with it. A civilization that maintains a second population center on a separate planet removes that single point of failure. A catastrophe that ends Earth does not end humanity if a self-sustaining human population exists on Mars. The two populations are far enough apart that no single event can reach both simultaneously. No asteroid that hits Earth also hits Mars. No pandemic that spreads through Earth's biosphere crosses vacuum. This is the argument Buzz Aldrin was making when he advocated for permanent Mars settlement. This is the argument Bruce Mackenzie embedded in his 1998 proposal. This is the argument that motivates the researchers who spend careers working on problems like radiation shielding and fuel production, and food growth on another planet. The work is not about satisfying curiosity, though it does that. It is about buying the species a future that is not entirely dependent on the continued good fortune of one planet. The first crew that lands on Mars and stays is not making a sacrifice. They are making a deposit. The first cells of a backup civilization placed somewhere that no single catastrophe can reach. Small, fragile, insufficient on its own, but present, alive, building. Every generation after them adds to what they started, slowly, then faster. The settlement grows into a colony. The colony grows into something that can sustain itself. The something that sustains itself eventually becomes a civilization in its own right, with its own identity, its own children who have never known Earth, its own blue sunsets and Martian ice and dust that never sleeps. The first humans to land on Mars may never come back. That may not be a tragedy at all. It may be exactly what survival looks like.